This is a story of total strategic self-destruction. This isn't the story of how the Nazis merely lost a battle. This is the story of how they lost the entire war on a single, cold, unforgivable decision. June 22, 1941. Operation Barbarossa launches. It was the largest invasion in human history. The goal? Not just to conquer, but to completely obliterate the Soviet Union, turning its vast territory into a 1,000-year agrarian colony. Adolf Hitler was convinced of victory in 6 weeks before the onset of the Russian winter. For a terrifying, fleeting moment, he was right. The attack was a colossal three-pronged spearhead, splitting the Eastern Front into army groups north, center, and south. The force deployed was staggering: over 3 million men, 3,400 tanks, and nearly 3,000 aircraft. It was an avalanche of steel and men, a force designed for speed, a force built on the terrifying efficiency of the Blitzkrieg. Against them, the Soviet army was a giant caught sleeping. Stalin had willfully ignored the warnings from his own intelligence and from Western powers, believing Hitler would honor the non-aggression pact, the most naive miscalculation of the early war. The initial successes were unprecedented. The German panzer divisions, led by tactical geniuses like Heinz Guderian, simply bypassed Soviet defenses, encircling massive numbers of troops. The sheer momentum of the attack was dizzying. The Soviet Union was losing entire armies, sometimes over 500,000 men captured in a single encirclement battle. Minsk, Smolensk, Kiev, major cities fell like dominoes. By mid-August, less than 2 months into the invasion, the German army had advanced hundreds of miles, and the Army Group Center was staring at the ultimate prize, Moscow. To the generals on the ground, men who understood the crucial role of momentum in warfare, the path was clear. Their doctrine, the essence of the Blitzkrieg, dictated that the primary objective must be neutralized first. Moscow was the political capital, the transportation hub, and the symbolic heart of the Soviet Union. Seizing Moscow would cripple the Soviet will to fight, shatter their logistical network, and almost certainly bring about the collapse of the regime. General Heinz Guderian, the father of the Panzer Division, passionately argued that Moscow was within their grasp and the momentum must be maintained at all costs. But Adolf Hitler, isolated in his bunker, was operating on a different, far more destructive calculus. Hitler was not merely seeking a military victory, he was seeking an economic and ideological triumph. To him, the primary objective was not the political heart of the Soviet Union, but its economic veins. He was obsessed with 2 things: the agricultural wealth of Ukraine to the south, and more importantly, the vast oil fields of the Caucasus, which lay even further south. Hitler saw Moscow merely as a geographical entity, a place the Russians could easily abandon. He believed the real strategic value lay in the resources that would allow the Reich to fight indefinitely. A captured Moscow would not give him the oil his tanks needed. The Caucasus oil, he believed, would win the long war. This was the point of no return. By mid-August, 18 days of fierce internal argument raged within the highest command of the Wehrmacht, the OKW. General Franz Halder, the chief of the Army General Staff, was driven to despair. He and Guderian argued vehemently for the continuation of Operation Typhoon, the advance on Moscow, emphasizing that time was running out and the infamous Russian winter, known to Russian soldiers as General Winter, was approaching. They warned that stopping now would allow the Soviets the one thing they desperately needed: time to regroup, to pull forces from Siberia, and to dig in their defenses. Hitler listened, but ultimately rejected their counsel with a fury that brooked no argument. His generals were bourgeois idiots who only understood the rules of the previous century's warfare. He issued his infamous Directive Number 33, ordering Guderian's panzer group, the very tip of the spearhead aimed at Moscow, to divert south to aid Army Group South in the Battle of Kiev and the Ukrainian grain basket. The momentum was broken. The blitzkrieg was abruptly halted. This was the fatal crack in the foundation of Operation Barbarossa. The Kiev encirclement was militarily successful, capturing over 600,000 Soviet troops, a massive tactical victory. But it was a strategic blunder of epic proportions. It was the ultimate example of winning the battle but losing the war. The 5-week delay necessary to execute the Kiev diversion was 5 weeks stolen directly from the narrow window of good weather. The generals knew it. Guderian later wrote, "We suffered a serious setback. The great object, the advance on Moscow, was put aside." The morale of the ground forces, which had been stratospheric, began to waver. They had believed that they were fighting for the quick, decisive knockout blow. Now they were fighting for political and economic side quests. By the time the final advance on Moscow, Operation Typhoon, was again authorized in early October, the Russian weather had begun to take its revenge. First, the Rasputitsa, the Russian mud season. The unpaved roads turned into endless mires of thick, clinging mud. German logistics, which depended entirely on good roads and rapid movement, collapsed. Trucks were useless, tanks were mired, and the swift advance ground to a humiliating halt. The men, already exhausted from months of intense fighting, were stuck, exposed, and vulnerable. The lost 5 weeks in Kiev now felt like an eternity. And then the unforgivable sin of overconfidence delivered its final blow. The Russian winter arrived early and with brutal intensity. The German army was only equipped for a short summer campaign. They had no winter gear, no antifreeze for their vehicles, and no training for combat in temperatures dropping to 40 degrees below zero. Hitler had explicitly forbidden the issuance of winter uniforms, arguing that they would not be needed, a horrifying testament to his fatal arrogance. The great object was within reach, but the price of diversion was paid in mud and frostbite. By December, the German army was within sight of the Kremlin's towers, but they were a broken force, freezing, starving, and out of ammunition. The Soviets, thanks to the very time Hitler had gifted them, had brought in fresh Siberian troops accustomed to the climate and launched a massive counteroffensive. This was the true, final turning point. The German army was thrown back from Moscow, its aura of invincibility shattered, and the dream of a swift victory in the East, the very thing Hitler could never forgive himself or his generals for losing, was dead. 2.0. The narrative now pivots from lightning success to the grinding wheels of strategic failure. By August 1941, the German spearhead was just 200 miles from Moscow. Why didn't they take it? This question became the critical, unforgivable hinge upon which the entire Eastern Front turned. The answer lies not in Soviet strength at that moment, but in a crippling, self-inflicted wound delivered from the very top of the German high command. The professional military men, the generals who had engineered the astonishing blitzkrieg victories, were unanimous. Moscow, the geographical and political nexus of the Soviet Union, was the objective. General Heinz Guderian, whose panzers led the charge, was frantic. He knew the brutal clock of the Russian climate was ticking down. He knew that every week of delay was a lifeline thrown to the reeling, collapsing Soviet forces. The panzer crews were exhausted, yes, but their morale was intact, and their vehicles, though strained, were still moving forward. The doctrine of the blitzkrieg demanded that the enemy be given no respite, no chance to establish a new defensive line, and certainly no time to gather their strength. Moscow was the inevitable, necessary target. But Adolf Hitler, the self-proclaimed military genius, saw the war through a different lens, one of ideological Lebensraum and resource economics. His obsession with the Caucasus oil and the Ukrainian grain overshadowed all strategic sense. He viewed Moscow as merely a collection of buildings, arguing that the true way to break the Soviet Union was to starve it of oil and food. He believed that if the Wehrmacht seized the resource-rich South, the communist regime would inevitably wither and collapse. This was the great debate, the furious 19-day argument that took place in Hitler's Wolfslayer headquarters in East Prussia. The generals presented logical, military arguments: capture Moscow, cripple the enemy's command and control, cut off the central rail hub, and achieve psychological victory. Hitler countered with geopolitical economic fantasy. The arguments were recorded in the diaries of General Franz Halder, the chief of the Army General Staff, who was driven to the brink of despair by his leader's obstinacy. Halder knew this was a mistake. He knew that delaying the final push would grant the Soviets exactly what they needed: time. But Hitler's will was absolute. He viewed any general who disagreed with him as lacking the necessary ideological ruthlessness. On August 23, 1941, Hitler issued Directive No. 33, the order that would later be viewed by military historians as the strategic death sentence of the Eastern Front. The order was simple, yet devastating. Army Group Center, the force poised for Moscow, was to be split. Guderian's Panzer Group was to peel off and drive south to aid Army Group South in the immense Kiev encirclement. Another tank group was sent north to assist Army Group North's advance toward Leningrad. Guderian was furious. He flew to the Wolfslayer to plead his case in person, arguing that this diversion would ruin the campaign. He warned Hitler that the time lost would guarantee the onset of the Rasputitsa and the winter before they could resume the Moscow push. Hitler, the Führer, was unmoved. He viewed Guderian's arguments as merely bureaucratic military thinking, lacking the grand vision of the German New Order. Guderian was ordered to follow the directive. The momentum was dead. This became the unforgivable fork in the road. The 5-week diversion for the Battle of Kiev was by all tactical measures a phenomenal success. The Kiev encirclement was the largest in military history, capturing over 600,000 Soviet troops. It was a massive, bloody haul, but the cost, in terms of strategic time, was incalculable. The panzer divisions suffered wear and tear. The supply lines were stretched hundreds of miles further south and then had to be re-stretched north. And crucially, the 5 weeks were gone. While the German army was bogged down in the Ukrainian steppes, Stalin and the Soviet High Command were executing exactly what the German generals had feared. They were stabilizing their lines around Moscow, hastily constructing 3 concentric defensive belts. They were pouring in every resource, every able-bodied citizen, and every last tank into the defense of the capital. And most critically, Stalin was recalling the highly disciplined, winter-hardened divisions from the Siberian and Far Eastern military districts, forces that had been held in reserve against a potential Japanese threat. These troops, fresh, well-equipped, and trained for the brutal cold, would become the sharp edge of the Soviet counteroffensive. 2.1. When Operation Typhoon, the final push for Moscow, was finally reauthorized in early October, the first signs of the disaster were already visible. The weather broke. The Rasputitsa, the mud season, turned the unpaved Russian roads into bottomless bogs. What should have been a rapid armored advance turned into a logistical nightmare. German tanks, trucks, and artillery pieces were mired up to their axles. They had to be pulled out by tractors, horses, or simply abandoned. The entire supply chain collapsed. Food, fuel, and ammunition could not reach the front lines quickly enough, and the speed, the very lifeblood of the Blitzkrieg, was gone. And then, the ultimate betrayal of Hitler's arrogance.
General Winter arrived. The first snow fell in early October, followed by a severe, unprecedented cold snap in November. Temperatures plummeted, reaching 30 to 40 degrees below zero. The German soldiers, still wearing summer uniforms, began to freeze. The conditions were medieval. The cold killed men far more efficiently than Soviet bullets. Cases of frostbite soared, crippling the Army's combat effectiveness. The equipment was just as vulnerable. The oils used in the German tanks and machine guns froze solid. The antifreeze in the vehicle engines was inadequate, causing thousands of engines to seize up permanently. While the Soviet T-34 tank had wide tracks designed for mud and snow, the German panzers, with their narrower tracks, struggled. The Soviet troops, meanwhile, were fighting in their native element, with quilted coats, felt boots, and equipment specifically prepared for the extreme cold. This was the realization of Guderian's desperate warnings. The 5-week delay in Kiev had been fatal. The advance that should have taken place in dry September was happening in the frozen, logistical hellscape of November and December. The German soldiers, exhausted and freezing, fought their way to within 15 miles of the Kremlin, so close they could see the spires of Moscow through their binoculars, but they were at the limit of human and mechanical endurance. The Soviet counteroffensive, launched on December 5, 1941, was the devastating, inevitable result of Hitler's strategic failure. The Siberian divisions, supported by new T-34 and Katyusha rocket artillery, smashed into the depleted, freezing, and immobile German flanks. The Wehrmacht, for the first time in the war, did not advance. It was comprehensively defeated and thrown back in panic. The retreat from Moscow was a disaster that shattered the myth of German invincibility. Hitler, realizing the catastrophe, blamed his generals immediately. He could not and would not accept that his own economic ideological fixation had doomed the campaign. He saw the failure as a lack of resolve, a failure of fighting spirit among the professional military leaders. In a furious, unforgiving purge, he sacked his commander-in-chief, Field Marshal Walter von Brauchitsch, and the Chief of Staff, General Franz Halder. He stripped General Guderian of his command. This massive firing of the Army's most experienced leaders was the final, devastating consequence of the unforgivable mistake. Hitler didn't just fire them, he blamed them for the failure of his own diversionary order. He then committed the ultimate act of hubris, taking personal command of the army himself. From that moment on, his strategic decisions were based on emotion, rigid ideology, and an ever-increasing detachment from military reality. The Wehrmacht would be led not by professionals, but by a corporal obsessed with oil and political symbols. The mistake of diverting from Moscow was the first nail in the coffin, and Hitler's refusal to forgive, followed by his desperate purges, cemented the loss of the Eastern Front and guaranteed the ultimate defeat in World War II. 3. The Soviet counteroffensive, launched in early December 1941, was not just a military action. It was the resounding bell tolling the end of the Blitzkrieg dream. The German army, frozen and fragile, was forced into a massive, desperate retreat. The Soviets, bolstered by the Siberian divisions who had arrived thanks to Hitler's fatal delay, recaptured hundreds of towns and pushed the Wehrmacht back over 100 miles in some sectors. This was the Battle of Moscow, and it was a devastating, undeniable defeat. The first time the Nazi war machine had ever been stopped and thrown back decisively. The psychological impact of this reversal was immediate and profound. For the German soldiers, who had been promised a swift 6-week victory and who had endured unimaginable hardship within sight of their goal, the morale collapsed. They had been told they were fighting a short war of liberation. They suddenly found themselves trapped in a grueling existential struggle against an enemy they had profoundly underestimated. The icy reality of the Eastern Front stripped away the Nazi myth of racial and military superiority. The German army was now in a fight for survival, hunkering down in makeshift defensive positions in the frozen Russian wastes. But the most catastrophic reaction came, predictably, from Adolf Hitler himself, a man whose entire worldview was built on the infallibility of his own will, could not accept that his strategic decision, the diversion to Kiev, was the primary cause of the catastrophe. Instead, he sought scapegoats. He refused to sanction a flexible tactical withdrawal that could have shortened the lines and preserved his forces. Hitler decreed a policy of holding at all costs, the Haltstellung order, demanding that every unit stand fast, often in indefensible positions, which led to the encirclement and destruction of countless German soldiers who could have been saved. This was the start of the Great Purge. In a furious, unforgiving act of self-deception, Hitler blamed the professional military men. He accused them of defeatism, of lacking the necessary fanatical will to fight. General Heinz Guderian, who had warned him about the winter and the Moscow delay, was dismissed from command in late December 1941. Field Marshal Walter von Brochetz, the commander-in-chief of the army, was replaced. General Franz Halder, the chief of the Army General Staff, whose diaries chronicled Hitler's descent into madness, was sidelined. Hitler did not stop at simply firing his generals. He took the ultimate, unprecedented step of assuming personal command of the entire army himself. From this point onward, the Wehrmacht was effectively led by a civilian with no professional military training, whose strategic decisions were driven not by logistics, reality, or military doctrine, but by intuition, rigid political ideology, and pure blind rage. The strategic framework collapsed entirely. The Nazi mistake of diverting from Moscow was the first nail, and Hitler's complete seizure of control was the hammer blow that drove it home. The generals who understood the logistics of fighting a war of attrition were gone, replaced by sycophants who simply followed orders. The consequences of this unforgivable strategic mistake rippled outward, determining the course of the rest of the war. Firstly, the shift from a war of movement to a war of attrition. The failure to take Moscow meant the Germans had lost the chance for a quick, decisive victory. The conflict became a total war, a war of resources, manpower, and production capacity. The Soviet Union, with its immense industrial base relocated far beyond the reach of the Luftwaffe in the Ural Mountains and backed by increasing American Lend-Lease aid, was perfectly positioned to win a long war of attrition. The Wehrmacht, despite its tactical brilliance, was structurally unsuited for this kind of grinding long-term conflict. Their supply lines were too long, their reserves too few, and their industrial output was simply dwarfed by the combined might of the Allies. Secondly, the birth of Stalingrad. The obsession with resources, the very thing that led Hitler to divert from Moscow, reappeared in 1942 as the goal of seizing the oil fields of the Caucasus. This led directly to the offensive aimed at the city of Stalingrad, a strategically important transport hub on the Volga River. Stalingrad was ultimately another fatal, unforgivable mistake, but it was a direct consequence of the Moscow failure. Had Moscow been taken in 1941, the political and military landscape of the entire war would have been unrecognizable. Instead, Hitler was forced to chase the oil he should have ignored, resulting in the annihilation of the Sixth Army, a far greater loss than any suffered in the Moscow retreat. The ghost of Moscow haunted Hitler to Stalingrad. Thirdly, the shattering of the invincible image. The failure at Moscow provided the first concrete proof to the occupied peoples of Europe, and crucially to the Allies, that the Nazi regime was not invincible. This boosted Allied morale across every theater of the war, strengthening the resolve of the British and encouraging American and Canadian efforts. The image of the unstoppable blitzkrieg was broken, replaced by the reality of freezing, defeated German soldiers. Hitler, until his final days, never truly forgave the circumstances that prevented him from taking Moscow, even if he refused to acknowledge his own fault. He would later repeatedly revisit the issue, always assigning blame to the incompetence of his generals, the betrayal of nature, General Winter, or the inadequacy of the German people's willpower. This inability to accept responsibility was the ultimate unforgivable act of self-delusion. The same arrogance that led him to divert Guderian to Kiev ultimately led him to micromanage the entire war, leading to further disastrous decisions like the insistence on holding ground in Tunisia, the suicidal defense of the Normandy coast, and the senseless defense of Berlin. The cold, hard truth remains. The swift, decisive victory that could have fundamentally altered the course of World War II was lost in the late summer of 1941 when Adolf Hitler ignored the unified pleas of his most capable generals and chose a tactical diversion, Kiev, over the strategic knockout blow, Moscow. The 5 weeks lost to the Kiev diversion cost the Germans 500,000 men, thousands of vehicles, and the entire momentum of the Eastern Front. And this is the essence of the unforgivable mistake. It wasn't the number of casualties or the loss of equipment. It was the loss of time and the loss of strategic clarity. The decision proved that Hitler's ideological and economic obsessions were antithetical to military reality, leading to the self-destruction of his own armed forces. It paved the way for the grinding war of attrition the Allies needed to win, culminating in the Red Army's final triumphant march on Berlin in 1945. The defeat at Moscow was the beginning of the end. This story of strategic self-destruction and fatal arrogance serves as a chilling reminder that in conflict and in life, the biggest failures often stem not from the enemy's strength, but from the hubris and flawed calculus of one's own command.